Metaversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and when discussing the pros and cons of curved blades versus straight blades, there's a couple of things, especially one that I find a lot of people actually aren't aware of, that I want to discuss in this video, because there are absolutely pros and cons to the whole discussion. And there is also a perception, though, that curved swords generally cut better than straight ones. I think that assumption is a little bit inaccurate from the correct perspective. The reason why I say that is because there's a whole lot of other important elements to keep in mind when figuring out what affects a sword's cutting ability. Edge geometry, thickness of the blade, how sharp it is, the weight distribution. Any one of those things that I just mentioned, when done properly on a sword, can have a far greater impact on its cutting ability than if it had a curved edge versus straight. But of course, being curved does impact certain things that we do need to acknowledge, but we shouldn't just think that just because a sword is curved, it's automatically always going to cut better than a sword that is straight. No, there's all those other elements that you need to consider. But with that context understood, what are some of the benefits, like legitimate benefits? Because there's bullcrap things people say that, oh, because it has a curved, it's just going to do better in this regard, right? No, I want to talk about what are the legitimate things, okay, benefits that you do get out of a curved blade versus a straight one, and in particular, one thing that I don't think I have seen a single sword enthusiast mention online ever. Maybe they, I can't think of one coming to my mind. But yet again, there's another caveat I need to mention, because this is a sophisticated topic, okay? And so to understand the correct context, you do need to kind of mention all these caveats. And this next one is that this isn't actually really a discussion between single-edged versus straight, because you can absolutely have straight single-edged swords that, you know, will have all the benefits or detriments that a double-edged straight sword would. And you can also have a curved double-edged sword. Now, people might think this is a straight sword. No, this is very much has a curved edge on it. In some ways, the actual curve at the tip is a greater curve than this two-handed falchion and katana has. And so in that regard, there's some very similar benefits that even this double-bladed curved sword, it's a leaf blade, gets the same as a single-edged curved sword. So then, what are the benefits? Well, people have assumed that having a curve on a blade increases its cutting ratio. That depends. And what does it depend on? Very much on the rate of curve. For this two-handed falchion and this katana here, I made a 3D model comparing this rate of curve to a straight sword, and when I say cutting ratio, this is talking about how much blade contact actually passes through the target when you cut versus a straight sword and one with a curve. And the theory is that having a curve means that the blade is going to kind of get drawn along the target for a longer period before it cuts through than a straight one, which means more cutting ratio. Because when you cut into something, having just a straight kind of slap cut or a hack where the blade isn't moving up and down is going to cut far less effectively compared to when the blade is actually drawn along the target. This is why draw cuts are usually considered to cut better, be more effective, than just kind of straight hacks. The incorrect thing to think is that you can't do draw cuts with a straight sword. You absolutely can. But people assume curves of this rate enables you to get a far more significant draw cut compared to a straight sword. That's false. When I compared this on the 3D model, the increased cutting ratio on a curve this shallow is pittance. So small, it's barely worth acknowledging, and it's not going to have any significant increase or improvement on the cutting ratio versus a straight sword. Now, if it was more heavily curved, like we see some shamshears perhaps, or tolwas, or killage, how do you pronounce it? Killage, those have far more pronounced curves that the cutting ratio and ease of draw cuts is far more significant, okay? So again, context, rate of curve. But does that mean, do curves of this degree, do they get any benefit at all? I do think they do. But there's another false assumption as well about this level of curve. And I've talked about this on another video. There's an assumption that because it has a curve, it's auto edge aligning. The edge alignment will just correct itself. And even I've talked about this in the past, and when I've rethought about it, I've found this is actually incorrect. Because the assumption is if you hold a katana like this, right, and you let it fall, it naturally falls into edge alignment. The problem is though, you don't hold a sword like this. You actually hold a sword closer to the hilt, especially the katana, and you strike more with it around here. And there's no effect. It's not rolling into auto edge alignment at all when you do it like that. And the other point is, even if you were to strike something holding it here at the very tip onto a target, it moves so fast through the target that there's no time for it to auto align and improve it. So no, the auto edge alignment thing, I've come to realize, is complete nonsense. That's not a benefit at all. I do think you can index the blade. What do I mean by index? You can, if I was to close my eyes, I can feel which way the edge is facing and angling due to the fact that it is off balance. Because the point is off balance from the center where I'm holding it, it does kind of want to roll. But by the way, this rolling action is rolling out of edge alignment, but with a solid grip, you can just resist it. And then you can feel the fact that there's weight pulling further down behind you. And so with a close your eyes, you can feel the direction of the blade, and then kind of you align the edge more naturally. How much of an effect does that really play when you're actually cutting? Because this is one of the reasons why a lot of swords, most in fact, there's exceptions, don't have perfectly circular handles. They're more oval or flat, because you can then index the blade by which way the handle is pointing just by your grip. And so because you can do that there, I'm not sure there's really any benefit from it being off-centered. So then again, what is the actual benefit of having a curve so shallow like this? There are two things that come to my mind, and honestly, these two elements don't get talked a lot about in regards to the benefits of slightly curved swords. One is the angle of attack. I'll elaborate more on that. And the other is the contact surface area of the edge. Now that last one, the contact surface area of the edge, I cannot bring to my mind anyone who's ever mentioned this, but I think it certainly must come into play. As to how effective it is very dependent on the target. If it's a flat target, yeah, it will get a certain, and it might even, yes, significant benefit from it, but if it's a circular target, it's probably negligible. Okay, first, angle of attack. What do I mean by that? A curved sword, well, curved swords aren't all equal. They don't, even if they have a shallow curve like this, it doesn't mean they're the same type of curve. Sometimes swords have mostly straight here, then they have a curve here, and then they're mostly straight here. And from this sword, from here to here, this is basically straight, barely any curve, and then the curve actually happens towards the end. And so even though it's very shallowly curved, where the curve is on the blade is important, because there are some curved swords that are very shallow that have most of the curve right at the hilt, where the blade is almost like off point from the line of the sword. And you know what sword more traditionally has that? The tashi, the predecessor of the standard katana. Yes, they existed in overlap, but tashi's a sword that was used more predominantly earlier than the katana. What's interesting about that, right? If you do have a sword that the blade is angled further back, right? That changes the angle of attack when you hit a target. The angle of attack in a sword strike is actually one of the more significant things that's going to determine if it's going to be an effective cut or not. If you do a cut where the blade just hits flat like that, okay, that's actually going to have a very different dynamic versus if I hit the target like this. One is type of a draw cut, but people sometimes get it confused about draw cuts where they think you must draw the blade in when you cut, but you can get more surface contact on the edge when you strike at a steeper angle like this, even though I'm not actually pulling my arms in. And so that angle very much affects cutting ratio. But this is the interesting thing, okay? You can actually achieve the same thing with a straight sword versus a curved one. A curved sword, depending on how curved it is, seems to just encourage a certain angle versus another. Now, having said that though, when it comes to swords that are actually off point from the handle, like a tashi, and even some really heavily curved swords like shamshirs or killiges, what's the plural for that? I get confused with how that's pronounced. But because it's so curved at the tip, when you're coming here, suddenly the angle of attack is much, much steeper, and you're going to get more drawing action on the target. It's interesting how a blade profile and design can actually encourage a certain type of use, even though the effects would be pretty much the same if you use a straight sword in that way versus the other one, but because one is straight and one is curved, you're more encouraged to use it a certain way. And I found that when I actually use it. When I use a curved sword, for some reason, the blade is pointing further behind, and so you just feel like it needs to trail further behind, and you end up doing more angular kind of cuts. I'm getting confused as to what I'm considering a shallow or but this is going to be shallow. For the sake of this video, this is a shallow angle and this is a more flat angle. And yeah, I do feel that curved swords encourage striking at shallower angles, even though you can absolutely do that with a straight sword where you strike at a very shallow angle and draw through the target. And again, you can do draw cuts, I've found, just as easily with straight swords like this versus slightly curved swords like the two-handed falchion. It's not to say that shallow angled cuts are universally better. They can generally cut more or better, but they actually lack a certain amount of leverage versus when you just strike more flat on. You can kind of see that, where if I'm in a structure like this, I'm in my biomechanical position is in a less optimal thing to really push my weight through, where if I slap it down like this, suddenly you can really drive force through, where like this, it's just easier for your structure to be broken versus when you're like this and you're braced against it. I've noticed this when we've been performing cut tests on pool noodles, that horizontal cuts for me, whenever I do like a more flat angle of attack like this, I rarely get through. But suddenly, if my angle of attack is like this and there's more sliding action, you can zip through a horizontal cut much easier. And interestingly enough, I noticed I was performing those horizontal cuts better with a katana versus the straight swords because I was just naturally more holding the sword at a sharper angle when I cut, not because I was thinking that, but by nature of this slight curve, for some reason I was just adopting that motion, and I wasn't for straight swords. But when I realized it, I was like, okay, I can adopt that motion when I do a sideways cut, and as soon as you do that, you're cutting just as well.
Do it then.
What, you want me to prove it?
You gotta pull this
Do it!
right there.
Do it! When you start to strike at the tip of the sword, okay, suddenly the angle of attack, even though it's only slight, right, it is on a slightly more steeper angle, like just with a slightly curved sword versus straight. And so you would get a natural benefit from the geometry of the sword being curved just with that. It's not huge, and I actually think the fact that it encourages you to hold it on a steeper angle to get those draw cuts actually produces a far more significant effect in the results than it just having the slight curve, comparing the exact same type of cut, you know, at the exact same angle of attack versus this curve and a straight blade. Now we come to the next really interesting benefit of having a curved blade, even slightly curved, and it can result in perhaps more significant benefits than we might realize depending on the target. And what I'm talking about here is the amount of contact on the surface area. The amount of surface area in any given impact between colliding objects, right, will determine how much of that force is focused. This is the very point of having a very fine edge on swords. All the force that you're putting into a cut, right, is getting focused on this very, very thin edge. And it's so thin, in fact, it creates a shearing force, which is a cut. If you put the same amount of force into a club, you're not going to cut through something. Now, in terms of blunt force, that can be beneficial, but we can obviously see the pros and cons between swords and clubs. But that's the science that's actually happening here. But yet, there's two planes to consider, not just this plane here, but also this plane here. Now, curved swords, by their very nature, when you strike on a flat surface, see how much contact is actually happening with the target. Because it's curved, only this portion of blade is actually having contact with the flat, which means the force is being focused more significantly on a smaller area, which means it'll bite in easier to the target. Now, of course, as soon as the blade sinks in even like a little bit, that force is going to be distributed over the entire length of the blade, which is why you'd have far more trouble trying to cut through something this long than something that's smaller. But it's about the initial kind of biting in action of the cut being focused on a smaller area, enabling it to actually have a bit more power than, say, a flat sword. As you can see right here with a straight sword, if you hit like that, distributed over the entire length. The thing is though, rarely would you hit so flatly on a target, and not all targets, barely any targets honestly, are this flat. Yet the principle I'm applying here will have an effect even on round targets just much, much smaller. Yet still, the principle I am talking about, well, it's emphasized on a lot of different types of sword. One great example is the Conqueror style falchions. By nature of its design, you're going to be striking with this area on the blade, and right here, look at how much contact the actual blade is having with any given surface. Even much smaller than the katana, which focuses in the cutting power onto an even smaller surface area, meaning it'll dig in more efficiently. When it comes to round targets, honestly, I think the effect of this type of curve and the amount of contact it's actually having with the target, curved versus straight, is going to be so minor, mostly negligible. It will make a difference, just very, very small. And when you're dealing with significant kind of force impacts, resistive material and stuff like that, I wonder how significant an effect it would be. It might be more than I'm giving credit, especially if there's a more pronounced curve, because when you strike into a target, right, the target will actually flatten out a little bit, okay, because of the impact before it bites in. And as a result, the surface area and curve will be playing a more significant role versus then the completely rounded surface, because things do get compressed and kind of flatten when you put force onto it, and suddenly when it's like this, there is a flat surface area of about yay long on this target. And then if it's slightly curved, just by nature, even like a tiny curve like this, that force is going to be more focused at the very tip of the curve, which will allow it to bite into the target that slightest bit more efficiently than if it was completely flat or completely straight. So those two things are, in my mind, the two most significant elements that affect a slightly curved sword's cutting ability differently and beneficially compared to a straight sword. How significant are they? Well, what do you think? I'm actually really interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and if you want to see this two-handed falchion in action where we give our actual review, putting it to the test, deep dive, breaking down pros and cons, we have a video for that. And you can check it out right now. Link right here to watch and see how good this two-handed falchion really is. And but that's it. This is a two-handed falchion. It's not a Kriegsmesser, all right? And it's a historically valid, authentic sword. Hope to see it. Enjoy it. You can click it right here. I'll just leave it here, and you can decide if you want to watch it. It's worth watching, though. Hope you enjoy.